Well, hi, everybody. This is the Welcome Facebook page where we're here to talk today with Jeana Thomas. My name is Brianna Stensrud, and I am the former director of Sanctity of Human Life Initiatives at Focus on the Family. I continue that work today, that pro-life work today, through advocacy and pro-life writing. And I am excited to introduce Jeana Thomas today. She has recently written an article for Christianity Today about her experience up close and personal with her entire family, taking in one of the migrant children that was separated from her family. And so today we're going to talk with Jeana about what that looks like. What does that mean? How did that even happen? Is that still happening today? And what that looks like about how we as a Christian fellowship of women really reach out to all of these sojourners who are among us and in our midst, and frankly, sometimes hiding among us as well, and what we can do to really engage and step in there. But today with Jeana, I just want to ask you real quickly, Jeana, if you could just maybe introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your family, and maybe how you got plopped right into the middle of this story that you're about to tell us.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Jeana Thomas. I'm a writer. I do a couple of other things too, but I am currently writing a book about this story. My husband and I have been married for almost 10 years, and we have two kids, one who's 7 and one who's 3. And we started fostering back in October of last year. When we were, I guess it was about 6 months into fostering. Our social workers knew that we both spoke Spanish. We were missionaries in northern Mexico for about 4.5 years, and our son was born there. So, several of us in the family speak some Spanish. And they gave us a call and said, "Hey, we have a girl here who doesn't speak any English. Would you be willing to take her in?" And initially we thought that it was just going to be a weekend thing because she was under federal jurisdiction. She was currently living with her sponsorship family through Office of Refugee Resettlement, and that family had neglected her. So they were looking for someone to take her in just for the weekend until ORR and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, would come and take her back. So we had another child in our home at the time and thought, okay, we can do this for a weekend. And on Monday, when everyone was supposed to show up in court, nobody did. So what was a weekend thing turned into actually about 4 or 5 months until we were able to reunite her with her family. And that story, if you're okay with me, just to keep going.
Sure,
on that.
yeah,
okay.
Please.
So initially, when she first came into our home, we weren't sure what her story was, and neither were the social workers. So it took a good while to figure out what exactly was going on, where her family was. We had heard reports of her family, her parents being deported, and then potentially one or both parents had died. So there was a huge amount of confusion that happened with trying to figure out where she came from and where she needed to get back to. Finally, we were able to kind of piece together her mom was back in Honduras, and her stepdad was also in Honduras as well, in a different area. But it took a good while to figure all that out. We knew right away when we were able to video chat with her mom that it was her mom. There was no doubt whatsoever that the two of them knew each other, that they loved each other. The mom was ready to come get her and trying to figure out how she could come up and get her. So again, the social workers were just going through the process of trying to figure out what to do. But when she first came in the home and ICE didn't come, and we thought maybe her parents had been they were either dead or just trying to figure all that out. Mm-hmm. There was a time frame where we were considering adoption. And as we talked through with the social workers, it seemed like once we did find out that her mom was alive and well and healthy and had a home that was capable for her to return to, it really felt like it was on us in a lot of ways to advocate for them to return to each other. And so because the social workers didn't speak Spanish. Me and my husband did. We did a lot of the legwork to
Wow.
try to translate for consulate connections and getting the newspaper word out, all the different things that you have to do through DSS to go through the process to get her back to her family. And after talking,
to be clear, Gina, she was placed with you through DHS, through she was, and that was already because you were already certified foster approved family for here in domestic foster care, correct?
Exactly. Yep. Okay. And because they were looking for a family that had two parents who spoke Spanish because she didn't speak any English.
Okay. So when you say that her sponsor family had neglected her, what is can you kind of explain what that means? So she was, when she came across the border, who did she come across with? And how can you kind of unfold maybe what that process kind of looked like and the transfer of this child and how she actually really ended up in your home specifically? Can you walk us through what that might have looked like for her or what that did look like for her?
Sure. So when she arrived at the border with her mother and her legal stepdad. So when I say legal stepdad, his name is on her birth certificate. And when they arrived at the border, prior to actually entering into the United States, the smugglers who had brought them there took her mom away, held her mom for ransom. And so then she crossed into the United States with her legal stepdad. And from there was then separated from that dad and came in because he was deported pretty much immediately. She came in officially as what's called an unaccompanied minor.
So they deported him without her intact and so killed her and deported him, and therefore she had no parent. She was then assumed as a minor coming across, and then ICE and DHS said, okay, so now what do we do that she doesn't have anyone here in the country? Next step is to
when they come across the border, usually it's through Border Patrol, which is under Department of Homeland Security. But then if it's an unaccompanied minor, if I believe it's 17 and younger, you are then placed into a department that's under Department of Health and Human Services, so DHHS. So ORR, which is Office of Refugee Resettlement, is actually under Department of Health and Human Services, not under Homeland Security.
Okay.
So that's where it divides right there. So when a child comes in unaccompanied, they then go into Office of Refugee Resettlement, and ORR then sends them to a sponsorship family.
And how old are those children typically? Is that 18 and under? Is that 12 and under?
Yeah, usually I'm pretty sure it's 17 and under. I could be wrong. It could be 18.
And the child that was placed with you was how old?
She was 5.
Okay. All right.
So she was then sent to a sponsorship family. Usually that family is someone who is somehow connected to someone in her family.
Okay. So and they validate that how? Do you know how they would validate that? Is that based off of the word of her stepfather who brought her over, or is that based off, how is that based? How do they know that?
I honestly don't know. I'm not sure. Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. So once they are in the sponsorship home, then the next thing that ORR does with that child is in 30 days, they will call and make sure that the child is okay. That's really the extent of ORR. That's as far as they go. So now the child is not really under any department at this point after the 30 days.
Wow.
And what happened was when she had been neglected, and neighbors were able to see that neglect and then call the police department on her about her.
Okay. So it was really, she was actually passed off to someone who they had thought was going to be a caring family for her, that was a relative of some nature. And then somebody in the community noticed that she was not being attended to, and then therefore just stepped in.
Correct. Wow. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So then DHHS then comes, what we call social services, came in and was able to then place her into our home until she could kind of go back under the jurisdiction of ORR and ICE. Yeah.
So you talk about how, I mean, what a whirlwind for your family. You think you're signing up for a weekend,
Yeah.
and then you're signing up for 4 to 5 months, unbeknownst to you. And you already had, as you mentioned, another foster child in your home.
Yeah.
So being kind of an experienced foster parent, what was different about this placement with this young girl than maybe a domestic foster care placement? What was the difference there for you?
Yeah, there's so many differences. First of all, children are not separated, or at least legally and ideally, they're not separated from their parents through DSS unless there's some kind of threat to that child's life. So it's neglect, abuse, or what they call dependency. And in this particular case, unlike all the others that I've heard as, foster mom and in community with other foster parents, this situation was so different because it wasn't her mom's fault that she wasn't with her mom. And so it was really challenging to try to figure out how to prove to the judge, because that's what you have to go through, prove to the judge that even though she was neglected more so by the system than she was by her parents, if that makes sense.
Okay, so you bring up something really, really good there. And I just want to remind people that feel free to ask questions in the comment section of the webinar. If you've got questions for Jeana about the story, about the placement, about anything, feel free to comment and we will answer those questions as we can on here. You mentioned that the mother, she was not at fault for this child not being with her. And what I just want to address about that is many people will say, well, that was the mother's fault.
Yeah.
She knew that when she came to the border that she would have this child taken away from her most likely. And so if you could just speak to that a little bit about, what kind of environment, what kind of state of mind do you have to be in as a mother to know the possibility that your child is going to be taken from you once you cross the border, but that is potentially a better option than where you are. Can you maybe address that a little bit? Because that is a question that people have is, hey, if you don't want your child to be separated from you, then don't cross the border illegally. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so there's two parts to that answer. First of all, in this particular case, this had happened at the end of October. And the official zero tolerance policy didn't begin until April. So this was not something that her mother knew really was a threat at all. But I would say that generally speaking, most Central Americans, and she's from Central America, most Central American families who are coming are coming for a better life. And obviously, I think if we can place ourselves in those mothers' shoes as mothers ourselves, if we are in a situation where we're in an abusive relationship and the police are not doing anything about that abuse, then we are then subjugating our children to that abuse. Or if we're in a situation where we are desperate to get a decent job so that we can put food on the table, it's a completely different mindset that says, I am going to do whatever I can to protect and take care of the children that I have, even if it means whatever the risk is in coming to the United States. And I think that's really what's going on here. Yeah.
So I guess we get asked a lot, and we get a lot of comments on the welcome page just about, well, this technically is the mother's fault because she knew that, and this is just a consequence of crossing the border illegally. And what I want to remind people is that when you cross the border illegally, that is actually a misdemeanor, and when it's not a felony. So here in the U.S., when you commit a misdemeanor, that's a parking ticket, that's speeding, your children, that's the level that we're talking about. So it's not an apples to apples comparison in that regard. And so when you get a speeding ticket, your child is not taken from you. when you don't pay a parking ticket, or when you have something along those lines, you don't get your children are not extracted from your family unit. And so that leads me to the next question I have for you, and that is, we do hear a lot that this cannot be traumatizing for kids, or if it is, it's low level. Again, parents are subjugating them to this. But can you maybe talk about what that actually looks like? That is traumatizing, and what that might look like, and what that does look like as you live that out for 4 to 5 months, seeing the effects of that separation of that child from that mother. Can you explain a little bit of what your experience was with that, and talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when she first came into our home, if we would say no to something, if we would negate a desire that she had, there would be kicking and screaming, potentially throwing things. There was a very giant rebellion against adults. And as I thought back on it, in the moment, it's like, this is really frustrating. I can't believe she's doing this. But when you stop and think and reflect back on her life, over the course of just a couple of months, she had been taken, she was in her home initially with her mom and her brothers. She has several brothers. And then came across the border intended to get across the border with 2 adults that she trusted. And then one adult, the one that she was closest to, her mother, was taken from her by other adults. And then the other adult that she was entrusted to was then taken away from her by other adults. And then she was with adults that weren't taking care of her. So, and we suspect there was some abuse as well as neglect. So, by the time she had gotten to our home, it didn't seem like adults should be trusted. So we really had to strive hard to show her that we loved her, and that saying no to her didn't mean a lack of love. And that was
having to do that instantaneously, just have a full-on trusting relationship immediately after 4 or 5 months of being separated from her mother, being separated from her father, being separated from anybody who would care about her whatsoever. Not to mention, just at the very beginning of her journey, making the trek that she did with her family. Yeah. So, I think most people don't realize that the job of the Department of Health and Human Services is to keep children safe. And so Absolutely. One of the things that they say is that they know it's scientifically proven that a child is better off with their biological parents. And yes. So they try everything to keep a child with their parents in their home. And and it can be a frustrating process because yes. people say, oh, that child, that parent's not doing a good job, or what, that child needs to be taken from that home. Mm-hmm. But what we're really knowing from science is that it is traumatizing. It's scientifically proven that it's psychologically damaging to a child to extract mm-hmm. them from their biological parents. So we need a very, very compelling reason to do that. Yes. And what you're saying is you're seeing the after effects of all of that, ripping that child away mm-hmm. from here and there. Yeah. So talk about what that experience was like for your family. What did that mean? I mean, you mentioned in your article, it was a wonderful story that you wrote for Christianity Today, Women's Christianity Today. And you mentioned that embracing heartbreak is part of carrying each other's burdens in a broken world. Can you talk a little bit about what that looked like tangibly to kind of carry this burden for this mother and for this child, and just in this whole entire situation?
Yeah, I think even as we talk about trauma, when people are traumatized, there's then secondary trauma. That trauma enters your home and it affects all of you. And I think that initially we just kind of had to push it at bay to survive. It was like I kind of had to shut down emotions to a degree, or was only allowed to have them in certain times and certain places in order to survive what was happening in our life and be able to move forward and try to figure out what the next steps were to be able to reunite her with her mom. But it certainly affected all of us. I mean, and this is not just specific to her case, but in general, as foster parents, we experience part of the trauma that the reactions to trauma that have come through the history of what each child has been through. And so that is then reflected in, being quick to anger with our own children, or being quick to anger with our spouse, or trying to really think through, like, why am I so frustrated in this moment? It feels like peace is gone. And I think that part of what I was trying to get across in that article is that, we kind of have this, we like to say as Christians, like, let's, peace is where we love the Prince of Peace and we bring him into our home, right? And so we kind of create this idea of what peace is. And what I have learned from this experience, even as just a foster parent, but not specific to this, is that, we don't really understand peace until we can extend that peace to people who don't have it on a regular basis, right? And so the peace that we create in our home, if it's only allowed to be peace for us, then I don't think that it's truly Christ-given peace, because he brings peace for everyone and his gospel is for everyone. So that like, what feels like this jerk against what peace is as you bring a child into your home is actually just this, like, rumbling within us that shows us that justice really is meant for everyone. And what we had built in our home is not going to last until we understand and realize that it needs to be shared and spread, and that we can even gain peace from her story and from her family. And she has lots to teach us. They have lots to teach us as much as we can teach them. And I think that's really important to understand.
I think that's a really good point, because the mission of Welcome is really to foster what it's like to carry out biblical hospitality to people. And I think, the American Christian kind of worldview is wrapped up in comfort. Yeah. And it is a huge inconvenience, yes, if we'll call it that. It's a huge inconvenience to bring a stranger into your home who kind of terrorizes, for a lack of a better word, terrorizes kind of your peace, upsets everything in your house, causes your own biological children to question and about their trust for you and their level of comfort and all of that. And you talk about in your article that you said ultimately it means surrendering our idea of good parenting. And really having to lean into the Christian community who will really work in the mess with you and not judge you about how you're handling your other kids and whatnot, because truly your children are just important as this little girl. And she's upsetting the entire apple cart. Yeah. But you're called to love her. You talk about trying to get rid of your own bias against your biological children versus her. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what maybe your view of hospitality, how that has changed, or what that was like trying to help foster that kind of understanding with your own kids?
Yeah, it's so challenging with our own children, because really in a child's mind, it's like this person has come in and is now taking all of the attention of my mom, and bothering me and not letting me watch the TV show that I want. And in her case, she wanted to watch things in Spanish, and our children wanted to watch things in English, and all these little tiny things that kind of build up within all of us that just kind of drive us all crazy. But really trying hard to have our kids empathize with the stories of the children that have been in our home. So when something would happen with my 7-year-old, usually I would be able to kind of logically talk him through, okay, let's think about this for a minute. What would it be like if you were living, if you're living in our home, and then all of a sudden, all of the rules that I have here, all of the rules that you grew up with, you suddenly have to go to another home, and all of those rules are wrong. And you have to live under a bunch of different rules that you've never had to do before. You would probably have a lot of the similar reactions that our, foster daughters had at the time. So just trying to really think through some of this stuff, like, what does it mean to have lived with trauma? What does it mean to cry yourself to sleep at night? Why are they crying at night? And our house was built in the 1940s, so there's not a lot of insulation. So they would hear a lot of, you can't really hide a lot of those sounds that would come. And when somebody's throwing stuff in the bedroom, like, you can't really hide it. So just trying to talk through with them, what is it like, and why would they respond in that way? And how can we love them even in the midst of being frustrated? One of the things that we would constantly tell, especially my 3-year-old, is you have to show love even when you don't want to. And so those kinds of things of just, like, kind of re-gauging them and creating different patterns. We talk a lot about loving others and all the different stories that we hear in the Bible, but like actually having to live it in our home day in and day out is a completely different thing. So
yeah. Did you find that your church community, your Christian community welcomed this along with you, or was that a hurtful piece of the puzzle? Generally, when you talk about your Christian community, there's not a whole lot of upsetting to that. Most people live kind of in this general comfort, and, we get to pick our small group. We get to pick what service we want to go to. We can pick what style of music service we go to. And so people can tend to be pretty hesitant to lean into the messy and the kind of the repetitive need of that some of this kind of trauma causes and asks people to really engage in. Can you talk a little bit about how you were either supported or maybe some ways that you weren't supported that you wish you might have been, that would have been helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a wonderful story to tell on that, and I really appreciate you asking that. I hear a lot of foster families in general that talk about the need for more support from their Christian community, and I will tell you that we have an amazing church that really wrapped itself around us during this time. And the most beautiful thing, well, there are several beautiful things about it, but one of the most beautiful things was that our pastor had worked in foster care before, and we had, it was so helpful. And we had several people within the congregation who either were foster parents or who knew about the foster care system because somebody in their family had kids in foster care, or social workers. So we had a lot of experience that kind of helped lift us up throughout this process, which was really beautiful. And one of the most amazing things, and this is maybe a little bit off topic, but it feels very strong and very important, is that our daughter she is Afro-Honduran. So she has very dark skin for a Honduran, and a lot of people in our church are African-American. And so it was a really beautiful thing because when she first came into our home, most of the people that she had trusted along the way were her skin color. And so she started having some major bias against her own skin. And then when we started being, more, we were, as involved as we always are in church, she was able to see just other people who looked like her, who loved her, who cared about God and cared about her. And it was just a really beautiful way that the Lord just kind of healed. I'm sure there's still more trauma there that will need to get worked through, but it was just a really beautiful piece of the story.
So you talked about your community really wrapping around you. Can you talk about maybe what are some of those tangible ways they actually provided hospitality towards her and provided tangible help in wrapping around you and your family during that time?
There's one situation in particular where she had recently come into our home and we were having a birthday party for my husband. And so we had several different friends that were here, including our pastor, and she tried to run away quite a few times. And this one particular time, I think it was just there was too much going on, so all of the noise in the house kind of set it off. But she wanted to run away, and so I figured, well, I can walk around the neighborhood with her and just see where she'll go, and just try to hear her heart in it, and try to figure out what she's trying to get to. So I kind of went outside with her because we needed some space anyways, and she started walking away, and I was just walking with her. And then at one point, I couldn't keep up with her, so she started running, and I couldn't catch her. So we had walked in the circle around the neighborhood, and I was walking back, and I was shouting for my husband to come and to be able to catch her. And my pastor was out in the yard, and he heard me. And so he grabbed somebody else, didn't even bother my husband, got in their car, and they circled around the block to be able to catch us both. And it was just this beautiful moment of he was not scared whatsoever to do this. He had dealt with these stories before. He knew what he was dealing with, and he was able to direct me in what to do and try to figure out what triggers were making her do this. And it was just amazing moment of how the Lord just puts the right people in your path to help you through the process.
Yeah, and I think that's super critical. You talked about your community being a diverse community of believers. You also talk about your community being willing to engage in those hard places and actually putting themselves on the line there too. And just so we're all clear on this, I know we've gotten a couple of comments about this, but we are in no way advocating for adoption of these migrant children who have great parents that want to be reunited with them. Jeana would be the first to tell you that she and her husband did most of the legwork in reunifying this child with her biological mother. And so what we just want to be explaining today is what Jeana's up close and live personal experience has been when she was placed with one of these migrant children who was separated at the border from her parents. And just kind of the heart behind really trying to accommodate all of that trauma and accommodate that child and love that child as best possible within that community. And one thing I'm really fascinated with is that you had to do a lot of the legwork for the reunification, which you would think that the government would play a really huge role in that. Can you talk a little bit about what that looked like and what you mean by we really had to do some legwork to do that? And you actually went and took a trip down to reunify her with her mother. Is that correct? I mean, that must have been amazingly emotional. Can you talk a little bit about that? Take us through what that journey looked like and then kind of your trip down there to reunify her with her mother.
Sure, yeah. So first of all, as far as the government doing the work, I think this was such a new and kind of different story that DSS wasn't really prepared for. So they didn't really know what was needed to be done, right? So they have their certain system and the things that need to get done typically, and it's pretty clearly set for those who have been neglected or abused by their own parents. However, in this case, it was kind of a confusion between, well, is this immigration court or is this family court? Like, what are we doing here? And because she was under DSS jurisdiction, we weren't able to go through immigration. It had to be done through DSS. So I kind of called around to a lawyer to try to figure out what we would need to do or how we could do this. And they were also doing stuff as well. We kind of figured out throughout the process that we really needed to get the consulate involved. That was the big issue. Once we got the county judge to sign off on her being able to be reunified, then we needed to get the paperwork to be able to take her back because she didn't have any papers when she came here. So she needed to be able to travel back. In regards to, and then we had to get a home study done at her home in Honduras. So those were all kind of the big pieces. And initially we didn't really know what to do as far as getting a home study done. So I tried to contact the equivalent of DSS down there in Spanish and didn't really get a lot of responses. They were trying to do it too they have a couple of people who speak Spanish, but it's only kind of like they don't get to have them there with them all the time. So it was kind of challenging to try to get that coordinated. And then talking with a consulate, for some reason, I think the consulate woman, because she spoke Spanish, that was her primary language. I think she felt more comfortable speaking Spanish. So she would communicate more with me than she would with the social worker. So I just was trying really hard to stay on top of that and make sure that the social worker was involved in all of the communication as well. So, and then just doing some research and trying to understand what ORR was, what ICE was, like what all these things were, and then kind of share that information with the social workers as well. So, so that's what I mean by doing the legwork.
A lot.
Yeah, it felt
full-time job right there.
It did. It felt like, wow, there's a lot going on. So, so yeah, it was interesting because it kind of felt like a little bit like it was taking me away from being present as a foster mom. But it was also really important to be doing it so that I wasn't, so that she wasn't longer separated from her family. So we were finally able to get the paperwork and we're able to kind of make plans to travel back. And I told the social workers, I said, I really want to go back with her because after all the trauma that she's been through, I feel like it's important for her to have somebody that she knows that can travel with her back down there so she doesn't have to kind of relive some of that trauma.
Right.
And so it just was able to work out really well with my work schedule. And then when they told us, they said, well, would Andrew want to, I think I said, it would be great if Andrew, my husband, could come as well. That way we could travel down together and, it wouldn't be me traveling alone. and the social worker didn't have a passport, so they would have to like extend the whole thing just by getting a passport for the social worker, and she didn't speak Spanish, so it didn't really make sense for her to go down. So it worked out for us to be able to go, and it was just a really amazing and beautiful thing, because at that point in time, we had been talking so much with her mom. We did a lot of video chats, a lot of phone conversations through WhatsApp. So we were talking with her regularly, and I still do, pretty much on a daily basis. We talk. So it was just wonderful to be the one to bring her daughter back to her and to see them reunified. And then we were able to stay with them for a couple of days at their home in Honduras, and then come back. So it was a really beautiful, difficult, hard journey, but absolutely beautiful.
So what was that like when they saw each other? Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like? And then did you see a change, kind of an immediate change in her, like, I am home? Or what was that like for you to see that happen?
Yeah, it was really beautiful. So we have a little video that I can share with you guys to be able to see them reunite. But basically, her mom was she was just getting giddy when we were in the airport waiting for her mom to show up. She was acting like, I don't know, she was making all these little cute noises, and she was just like jumping up and down and just so excited and ready for her mom to get there. And when her mom came up, she looked at me. We were in the lobby, and there was like this big open doors, automatic doors, and her mom was coming up the stairs towards the doors, and she looked at me like, can I go run towards her? And I was like, yeah, go, go, go. And so she like runs out to her and just like scoops her up, and they embrace each other, and then they're crying and telling each other they love each other. And I'm like trying to video and trying to hold my emotions in and trying to say hi to the guy that came with them at the same time. And but it was just this amazing, beautiful moment, and it was really interesting and very I'm really, really glad that we got to stay a couple days with her at her home, because it was neat to see how she was kind of able to separate herself from us as parents and kind of lean back on her mom. So there was one situation that I remember clearly where we were walking through the local mall there, and there was a Dunkin' Donuts. We were sitting down at the Dunkin' Donuts, and in our house, we have a lot of rules, and we're like, you need to sit still in your chair. You can't jump around when you're eating and stuff like that, which is a lot different from, what she grew up in and what she's used to. And so we were sitting at the Dunkin' Donuts, and she's sitting on her knees and kind of like moving around, and she looks over at me, and she's like, in English, she says, "Do I need to sit right?" And I said, "If your mom doesn't tell you, then you don't need to worry about it. You just listen to what your mom says." And her mom didn't say anything, so then she was just kind of back to like jumping around. And I know that's like a silly example, but it was just like this beautiful moment of her realizing, I'm not theirs anymore. I'm back to my mom and back to my mom's rules and my mom's home. And we were playing Spot It at her home. At one point, we brought the game down. And at one point in time, I think Andrew had said something about a rule that we normally have at our house, and she was like, "This is my house now," and we are under my house. And it's kind of funny, like this moment of like her kind of talking back a little bit is what we normally would think of it as, but like looking back on it, it was like this is her healthily moving towards being back in her own space, and it's really important for her to be able to do that. So it was really beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what was that environment like? Obviously, her mom was fleeing to come across the border for a better life. Was she in a different place than where she was before? Or could you just drastically tell the difference and the quality of life and kind of understand where she was coming from, or just grasp some new perspective? What was your take on that environment?
Yeah, so I had lived in Honduras before I had gotten married. So it wasn't a whole new environment for me, but it was really interesting just to see even the difference between the lifestyle that I had when I lived there, and I had shampoo, and I had laundry soap, and all this just kind of different things than what they had when we were there. And hearing more of her story, a biggest part of the reason that her mom even came across the border was actually to get a job, to get the money that her mom needed for the mom's grandfather. the grandfather had been diagnosed with a disease that cost it was a very expensive medicine that he needed to survive. And so her whole mentality was, I'm going to go to the United States for a couple of months, get enough money to be able to buy this medicine so that my grandfather can live.
Wow.
So it was never her intention to actually come and live here forever. It was only to live for a little while. Her 3 boys were still at the home, and the grandma and grandpa lived there as well. So it was interesting, walking back into that environment, kind of seeing the difference. A very drastic difference. We had a lot of different people that had donated clothes to our foster girls. And so when we brought her back, Andrew and I just brought little backpacks, stuff for us. And then we filled up huge suitcases of her clothes because she had so many. So it was just interesting to even see that, and how her brothers lived and her mom lived, and how the amount of clothes that she had gotten even from us bringing them down there was just so much more clothes than she probably ever has had in her life. And really more than she needs, to be very honest. But just some of those drastic differences of recognizing what life is like there for them, and her as a single mom really being in charge of not only her 4 children, but also her grandma and grandfather. So,
wow. Well, I mean, the comments that we've had so far, just we appreciate just your support of Jeana and her family taking on this monumental, significant task. Jeana, if you could, what was your biggest, we're going to wrap up here, but what was your biggest takeaway, and what might be the biggest theme that you would want people to walk away with because of your story and what you had experienced? What is maybe a big misconception that you think people might have, that based off of your personal experience, this close to the situation, what you might tell people or want people to know from that?
Yeah, there's definitely several, and I'll have a lot more in my book, but I think one of the biggest things is recognizing that like we had talked about before, the government really currently, within foster care, the only reason that they're separating parents from children is for the sake of protection of the child. And I think all of this zero tolerance policy is really flies directly against that policy, because it is not for the protection of the child to separate the child from their parents. And like we had talked about, there's trauma. I had just recently heard Diane Guerrero talk about her when she was 14 years old when her parents were deported, and she was left in the United States, and she's a grown woman now, and she's still dealing with the trauma of that. And I think it's really important for us to understand that these separations are causing more trauma and really not protecting the children whatsoever. So I think when we're talking about, being pro-life and being pro-family, it just feels like this very much goes against both of those things.
Right. Yeah. I think, in today's evangelical Christian worldview, people talk about being pro-life and they talk about being pro-family, and yet there is a legitimate concern about safety. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I love that World Relief and Jenny Yang and Matthew Soren's always talk about is that we can be a safe country and we can be a compassionate country. Absolutely. We can be a just country, and we can also have mercy as well. And those things are not mutually exclusive, but those things can coexist in a beautiful way, where there is humane treatment for those who are made in the image of God, who are seeking a better life, who are very vulnerable. And just for us to have, we can have our fears really take over what might be a gift that the Lord has for us, or a learning that the Lord has for us. And I think you're a perfect example of what that looks like, to kind of walk into something with kind of fear and trepidation, but then see the Lord really create something beautiful and tangible for you and your family. And thank you so much, Jeana, for joining us today. Thank you all for watching today. Thank you for watching this if it's recorded as well. If you've got questions, feel free to ask them. You can also look up Jeana Thomas on Women's Christianity Today and look up that article as well. So thank you so much. We hope you have a great day. Thank you, Jeana.
Thank you. Appreciate it.